my concern is relatively low. But on occasion, you'll have an athlete where you're really concerned. And in that setting, it's important that you're not sending him to the local ER where there's not a neurosurgeon, but that you're sending him somewhere they actually have a neurosurgeon on site and a suite there as well. So, for example, we had a cross-country runner who tripped and she took a header down 25 concrete steps. She was unconscious. She then gained consciousness, and her coach actually walked her into our training room. And on that one, I'm not calling the ambulance to send her to our local hospital, but I'm sending her to a place where we have a neurosurgeon. So I think that's the only piece that's different about the emergency action plan as it relates to concussion. So again, Kevin had the same date, which is good. I guess we were both at the same place in April, and this is what the NCAA came out with, basically that you must have a physician-written concussion management plan on file. You must educate your coaches as it relates to concussion. Student athletes have to be educated as well, and they now sign an agreement that states that they have been educated, they know the signs and symptoms of concussion, and that they will report all of their injuries to their athletic medicine staff. Again, this is the language of the Zach Leistat. Any athlete that has behaviors consistent with concussion is removed from play and evaluated by a healthcare provider, and that if they're diagnosed with concussion, they don't return to play, and that they have to be cleared by a physician. And again, you know, if you take it 10 years ago, 15 years ago, not a lot of our schools actually had team physicians, and a lot of these concussion decisions were made, and they put them back in, and they never saw a physician. So I think things have changed, and certainly, again, NCAA should be applauded in terms of their efforts. As it relates to sort of what do you get in your baseline evaluation, I think it's important to ask questions related to modifiers, which I'll talk about in a minute. And they did say that you have a baseline evaluation that should, at minimum, include symptoms, a cognitive evaluation, and a balance exam. And that there's a utility in terms of neuropsychological testing, which many of you guys are probably familiar with, but that this should be implemented and developed with the help of a neuropsychologist, and that ideally the results should be interpreted by a neuropsychologist. Again, a little bit of a challenge to what many of us are doing. These are some modifiers, and probably most important is this idea of concussion history. How many have they had, how recent, and how long were they out of activity for? We have a football player that came in this year, has actually had only 2 concussions, one playing football, one playing lacrosse, which really wasn't a sport-related injury. He actually had been out and ran into a pole, and then tried to play lacrosse, and a week later reported his symptoms. Well, he came to our camp and had been told that he wasn't ready to play football yet, but he was okay to condition and lift weights. Well, he wasn't at all. He was really symptomatic, and it's now a year, almost been a year, and now we're in this discussion about whether he should return to play football. He's fine, but at the same point, it took him about a year to get better. Does he return with 2? And then the idea of age, that's certainly a modifier. Down below, in terms of pre-existing conditions, migraine, depression, anxiety, learning disabilities, and headache disorders seem to be modifiers. In other words, athletes that have these situations sometimes take longer to recover. Now, in terms of education, one of the first things that I had to do as the chair of the Return to Play subcommittee for the NFL's Head, Neck, Spine Committee was we had to come up with a poster for the locker rooms. And this was a little bit of a challenge. Fortunately, the CDC was able to help us out, and we came up with that. And as soon as we put it out, there was a cry for having something for youth. So there's a poster out there. And one of the things that I think is interesting in terms of what the information is that we're putting out there, for the NFL players, what we were putting out was, again, report your symptoms, and report it if you have a teammate you're concerned about, get checked out, have the athletic medicine staff evaluate you. And then there was a piece in there about, what are the long-term consequences that we don't know quite everything about. And that was what went into the NFL locker rooms. The NCAA has a tremendous amount of information that's available. It's on their website. It's fantastic. There's actually a concussion video that talks about and uses student athletes as examples and goes through all of signs and symptoms. There's a lot of this printed material, which again is available, and it's really good information. CDC is co-branded with a lot of different sports organizations, and again, this is a sticker that goes on the back of your clipboard. Again, signs and symptoms, what to watch for, as well as your emergency numbers as well. For those of you that have young kids or you know, there's CDC information related to young kids up even as low as, you know, 6, 7, 8 years old. They have a tremendous amount of information on the CDC site. Again, there's online physician training. There's all kinds of information. There's videos that they've developed that we've been working with them to help develop. And really, there's a ton of resources out there. I think the part is getting it to you know, every level and every parent. I want to touch on the concussion, the helmet piece, and Kevin mentioned it, so I'm going to basically just put these up here to tell us again that there's a lot of myths out there as it relates to concussion and equipment. And we know that, you know, there certainly is a role for mouth guards with protecting your teeth, but they doesn't seem to do much as it relates to concussion. And then, as he mentioned, this higher impact that you see doesn't always correlate with clinically what we see. And I think that's an important point as well. And certainly in the sport of women's lacrosse, this is an issue because everyone wants to put a helmet on these young women, and I'm not so sure it's the right way to go, although there may be some role for it. But be aware of the fact that this is an issue not just in football, this is an issue in many sports. And again, the reality is that my sense is we are doing a lot of work as it relates to equipment and other issues, but prevention, in my mind, starts with education. And I think that's the take-home message here, is that we have to increase the awareness of signs and symptoms. I agree with Kevin that I think part of the reason we're seeing more of this being reported is that we're being proactive and making sure athletes understand, number one, what are the signs and symptoms, and number two, why is it so important? This isn't their knee, this isn't their ankle, this is their brain, and it becomes really important. I think that we have more athletes come to me and say, hey doc, can you check me out? I want to make sure I don't have a concussion. We have to make sure, if you could play this video, we have to make sure things like this don't happen, and it happens again. I'm showing you a hockey video because this occurs in not just hockey, I mean not just football, but every sport. You play this. So you'll see a player come back with the puck, and he gets lined up, and as he releases, he gets lined up. And again, we have to do something about changing the culture of sport. We see it in lacrosse, where athletes are being punished. We see it in hockey. We see it certainly in football, and I think we've made some great efforts to change it. At youth hockey, they've done some things, looked at, there's called the fair play rule, where they've actually put in place for youth level an enticement or enhancement where you get a point if you stay below a certain number of penalty minutes. And they actually played it out in Canadian youth hockey, and it actually works. It affects the standings. They get 2 points for winning, they get a point for losing, and they get a point if they stay below the penalty minutes for their age group. It's something that lacrosse is looking into too. And I think those are areas where we look at trying to change the way that we're approaching this problem and trying to figure out a way to decrease the number of exposures that we're seeing. So again, they've seen some promising data when it relates to decreasing injuries. So again, my sense is that a lot of this is having education, having an awareness as to what's going on. The equipment and strength and conditioning, I do think plays a role, but my sense is it's relatively minor compared to everything else. Changing the culture of some of these sports really has to happen, and I think a lot of different organizations are working to do that. We have changes and rules that we can put in place. We have rules that we just need to enforce. And again, that's another area where the whole idea is trying to decrease exposures. The Ivy League has tried in the sport of football. We had a committee that came together and said, how can we decrease what we're seeing in terms of concussion? We ended up implementing changes in the rules as it relates to the number of contact days that we'd have. So it ended up being about a 40% decrease compared to what the NCAA had put out in terms of their rules. And again, we're trying to look at different ways to approach this issue, and the jury's out yet in terms of whether it's made a difference, but my sense is that it will. We're also now looking at the sports of hockey, lacrosse, and soccer. And again, it can be challenging in sports that aren't contact sports to try to figure out how do you decrease exposures or how do you minimize the potential issues related to concussion. So just to conclude, it's important that you have a written, it's a mandate. You have to have this, like a written concussion policy. Determine how you have to best implement your resources in terms of implementing the plan. Incorporate a concussion plan into your emergency action plan. I think that's pretty relatively straightforward. And this emergency action plan really is a team approach. And oftentimes we stand up at the beginning of our season with our coaches and they kind of go, yeah, I know. But when it really comes down to it and you have an emergency, having practiced this is important, and having all your coaches and administrators kind of in this together with your medical staff really can prevent major problems. Practice makes perfect, and always kind of err on the side of caution. Education is certainly important. I think at times it can be challenging in terms of trying to get the message out, and I think that's part of the reason why we have some of these mandates now. We have to message to our athletes every way we can. They're sort of technologically way ahead of us, so I think we need to try to have a multi-pronged approach in terms of how we get this message out to them. And you folks and the coaches, administrators are really an important component of this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Margot. And I also want to echo the message of gratitude to Dr. Shelton and his team for your incredible hospitality and for this opportunity. In the spirit of self-disclosure and true confessions, I guess, as someone who toiled away in the trenches of Division III football seemingly 100 years ago and loved every minute of it, I used to dream of the day when I would be able to perform under the bright lights in front of an audience of all the major college football coaches in the country. I didn't think I'd be 50 years old by the time you showed up, but nonetheless, I'm glad you're here this morning, and in many ways even happier than I would have been then, perhaps. My assignment this morning is to come on the heels of Margot's message and impart on you, I guess, briefly summarizing this morning how we've taken the guesswork out of this injury and how the science has really delivered on the former unknowns about sport-related concussion and filled in the blanks for us and given us a leg to stand on, not only in clinical decision-making, but when it comes time to implementing public policy, whether that be at the collegiate, high school, or other professional competitive levels. And so that's my job here in the next several minutes. I think Kevin has put the ball squarely on the tee here this morning with the message that this is not a new injury. Arguably the most dramatic concussion in NFL history occurred in October of 1960. Some of you may recognize local bad boy Chuck Bednarik from the Eagles, and you know who that gentleman is on the ground. That's Frank Gifford, who was rendered unconscious, and believe it or not, in that day and age, remained out of play for 18 months after a sport-related concussion. Never made the front pages of the paper like it does now, but I think as Kevin has pointed out, it's really been recurrent injuries to high-profile professional athletes that have brought this on to the front burner. The message I hope to leave with you this morning is that there's not only a new level of awareness about this injury, but the real game changer in the last decade has been what the science has delivered for us. And I'll briefly walk you through that progression. In the neurosciences, concussion, whether it be in sports or otherwise, is arguably the most complex of all neuroscience disorders. And historically, we've been plagued by a number of puzzling questions, ranging from how much is enough to cause brain injury at a biomechanical level? And once we've established that an injury has occurred, what are the most effective clinical methods that I should be using in my practice to diagnose and evaluate athletes? Beyond that, what do we know about how long it takes to recover, both clinically and at a physiological level after this injury, which ultimately then drives the answer to the question, when is it safe to return to play? Kevin and Margot have squared up for you the concerns that have come onto the horizon really in the last 5 to 10 years about what happens when they get old. What are the potential long-term consequences of repetitive concussion in a sporting environment? Historically, we had limited or no clinical tools available to us to evaluate this injury, and we had very little evidence base to drive best practice. Now that's been changed in the last decade, again taking some of the guesswork out of this, moving from subjective clinical expertise to now an evidence base scientifically that drives our practice. That movement really over the last decade has followed a progression just like your normal playbook does. Starting perhaps 15 or so years ago, Kevin and I were involved in the early work in developing some more standardized tools beyond how many fingers am I holding up, what's your name, Bubba, so on and so forth, that would assist us in a standardized approach to assessing and diagnosing this injury that then drove the science as to informing us on the true natural history of recovery. We had tools available to us that would quantify the effects of this injury within minutes. We could repeat those instruments at various time points post-injury to track recovery, and I'll show you what those curves look like here in a bit. Ultimately, then, better assessment methods drove our movement toward evidence-based return-to-play decision-making and ultimately making this sport safe. I think the common denominator across the four of us is that we have a strong passion for sports. We all participated at various levels in the past. We have kids who are heavily involved in many sports. Asked my parents this weekend as to how many sporting events they're hauling my kids to while I'm here. And I think the important piece and a message that can't get left out of this discussion this morning is that the science has to evolve in the context of what is reasonable and practical in the competitive sporting environment. We're not going to roll an MRI machine down to the sideline of a football field or a hockey rink. And I think that's been the backdrop for our work over the last 20 years, and frankly, we're probably as proud of that element in the sporting environment as we are our research findings themselves. Our research group has been at this since the mid-90s, roughly 1995, and to give you some idea of the hard work that all of our people have put into this, we've enrolled more than 23,000 athletes in our baseline testing protocols over the last 15 years or so. We have more than 1,000 injuries in our clinical database that really is the evidence base that drives many of the findings that I'll be presenting to you this morning. So, as Kevin pointed out, one of the earlier questions was, how much is enough to cause brain injury, no matter the competitive level? And we think about what we see on high school football fields. Those are 6-year-olds. Remember that drill? We all did that one several times a week in grade school, high school, and we did that in college, if you can believe it. And it's not only answering the question, how much is enough to cause brain injury, and that informs us about helmet safety and so on and so forth, but it tells us about what types of impacts are likely to cause injury. That then informs what should we be doing on the practice field during the week, and what kinds of things could we avoid to keep our players in better shape for Saturday afternoon. Beyond the impact of injury science and the biomechanics that Kevin talked about in greater detail, the real burning question that was emerging 10 to 15 years ago was, what's the true natural history of the injury? And that's a term that we apply in all corners of science. In cancer, we want to know what's the true natural history of lung cancer, and how do we intervene to prevent it, to treat it, put people back to working gainful lives. In a concussion context, it divides really into two discussions. The first is, how long does it typically take for an athlete to reach a full recovery in their symptoms, their cognitive abilities, and other clinical aspects of the injury? And then the more exciting science that has emerged in the last 5 years is, how do we know when recovery has fully occurred at a brain level, a physiological level? And the composite, really, of those two time frames, whether they overlap or whether one is slightly more extended than the other, is really what we consider the true window of cerebral vulnerability. What is an athlete's risk period? And then that drives our decision-making about when it's safe to return to play. And I'm happy to share with you this morning that really the news has been quite promising. We hear a lot about poor outcomes. We hear a lot about catastrophic injuries in the news. What we don't hear about are the good outcomes that are observed in athletes who sustain a single uncomplicated concussion. This is a paper that Kevin and I and our colleagues published a few years ago from the first NCAA study, about 10 years ago, looking at what the acute effects of sport-related concussion are and trying to plot the true natural time course of recovery in symptoms, cognitive abilities like memory, concentration, etc., and postural stability or balance after concussion in a large group of college athletes affected by concussion. Let me orient you to these data. So these are data actually from 3 very large studies that we've conducted over the last decade. The first NCAA study, the CDC-sponsored CPI study that Kevin led, and this is a Milwaukee-based high school study that's been ongoing now for 17 years. Again, there's over 1,000 athletes with concussion in this sample, and you'll see here that we've categorized their self-reported symptom recovery based on those that report that they're completely symptom-free within a day, those that take somewhere between a day and a week, and then those that take a bit longer to recover in their self-reported symptoms. And looky here, about 20% of our athletes report a complete symptom recovery within the first 24 hours. 85% of them are reporting a complete symptom recovery within the first 7 days. Now, the obvious criticism from many corners against these data is what? It's self-report, you can't believe them, et cetera, et cetera. And what's magical, particularly in a football world, what's magical about 7 days? Just look at your schedule. The multidimensional approach to assessment. It's not relying solely on symptoms. Frankly, as a neuropsychologist, I'm also here to say it's not as simple as a single neurocognitive test, taken on a computer, paper and pencil, or otherwise. These injuries come in all flavors, and really the importance is a multidimensional approach that allows you to assess their symptoms, their clinical examination findings, their cognitive functioning, their balance, their history, et cetera, that provides you, again, an ability to take the guesswork out of concussion management and have a more composite index of that athlete's overall recovery that then drives your decision-making about return to play. And so let me show you very briefly what the recovery curves look like on performance-based measures. On the far left here is the data that I just showed you about symptom recovery, indicating that in our sample, 85 to 90% of athletes report a complete symptom recovery within the first 7 days. It turns out that on cognitive testing, the recovery, I'll save you the explanation of these complex graphs, but the punchline is that even on performance-based measures of cognition and balance, relative to the athlete's individual baseline, 90% demonstrate a performance-based measure of functional recovery in the first 7 to 10 days. If I'm a parent, and this is a message that I impart on soccer parents, football parents, and otherwise, the message is, if your son or daughter sustains a single uncomplicated concussion, it's a transient neurologic event that is going to manifest in significant symptoms during the first few days, but more than likely, there's a 90% chance your son or daughter is going to be fine in about 7 to 10 days. The trick is that during that first 7 to 10 days, that's also the period during which the athlete is at the greatest risk of a same-season repeat concussion. That's the evidence that drives clinical decision-making around return to play. That's what clinicians look to. What that also allows me to do in the clinic, though, I can establish a currency with the athlete. And that currency is, listen, you give me 1 week right now, you're probably going to be fine, and there's no looking back. You try to steal a week from me right now, in about 3 weeks, I'm going to take 6 weeks from you. Now, many athletes, like all of us, are of the ilk that I'll take those odds, I'll take that chance. But I will tell you that there has been a change in the culture that if the athlete understands that if they're given adequate recovery time, that drastically reduces their risk of a repeat injury and their participation will be uninterrupted from that point forward, that's logic they can understand. They can also understand that if I've got a high risk of a repeat concussion in the next week, and I try to cut a corner here and play Saturday, that could then cost me the rest of the season, they're at least willing to stop and think about it and maybe get some counsel from parents, coaches, otherwise. But without these data, we couldn't have those conversations either with clinicians about return to play decision making or about athletes in informing them of their risk. That window of repeat risk also begs the question, how long does it take for the brain to recover at a physiological level? And we can go beyond symptoms. We now have very advanced technologies, whether it be neuroimaging, biological markers, we use electrophysiological testing as well, to take a look under the hood, if you will, and get a sense for what is the time course. We now have a lot of data that tells us how long does it take for symptoms, cognitive functioning, and balance to recover. But how do we know when the player is fully out of the woods and the brain has made a full recovery? And that has really established for us a model, a theoretical, empirically based model of recovery after sport-related concussion. And that is, what the data tell us is that a concussive event occurs, and there's a period of a few days during which that athlete is likely to experience significant symptoms, deficits in memory and other functional abilities. And then they start to reach a complete recovery. They come into the training room, say they're good to go. They demonstrate full recovery on cognitive testing, back to their baseline, et cetera. But there is emerging data to suggest that there's a slightly more extended window that is required for recovery to fully occur at a physiological level. What we believe is the combination of those two time periods represents the total window of risk, and that prevention-based clinical decision-making occurs once the athlete has reached a complete recovery clinically and physiologically. And Kevin and our group, where we're spending most of our time and effort these days, is in trying to determine, like we did years ago, in determining the clinical time course of recovery, how long is that, and can the athlete be participating in non-contact exertional activities, ramping up without any harm, so that when that time period has elapsed, they're good to go and they're returned to full participation. There has been mention here this morning about the new concerns that are looming on the horizon about how many is too many, or is the question rather how much is too much? Is it total exposure or the number of concussions that predict whether I'm at risk for late life complications or consequences associated with sport-related concussion? We're happy to announce that our institution, along with Kevin at North Carolina and our colleagues at UCLA and Michigan, are now embarking on what we're referring to as the National Sports Concussion Outcome Study, with some generous support from the NCAA that we're very thankful for, and some other funding agencies that will allow us to look at tracking youth athletes, high school, college, and so forth, over a longer span of time to prospectively determine what are the true risks. I think Kevin shared with you that our concern is that perhaps the lay media or the popular press has raced out in front of the science, sensationalized this topic, and perhaps jettisoned more fear into athletes than would be justified based on the science that's available to us at this point. This initiative is intended as, again, a prospective look at this to determine what the true risks are. I'm going to wrap up with one concluding message that 15 years ago I never could have dreamt that I'd have a slide like this in the deck. And that is, while the advancements that we've made scientifically related to sport concussion have undoubtedly helped the sports medicine world put athletes in a better place, frankly, in understanding this injury and preventing them from the risks. But there's a bigger picture here, and that is that what has been going on in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last decade, where traumatic brain injury is really been referred to as a pandemic, the most commonly occurring injury in the current war theater, essentially the template that the DoD has adopted for diagnosing, assessing, and making decisions about return to activity in war was borrowed from the lessons that we have learned in sports concussion research over the last decade or so. Kevin and I and others have been involved in a lot of work with the DoD. So many of your institutions have carried the heavy bags in this scientific movement over the last decade. You can be proud not only for what benefits have been derived directly to the sports world, but also to the bigger picture in helping the men and women that are serving our country abroad and facing risks with much greater stakes than we do in the sporting environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kevin asked me to talk a little bit about our experience with the NFL and the culture change. And I think you've heard a lot of comments today around the margins of that issue. And I'll try to cover a little bit of our experience over the past couple of years, what we've seen, how this dovetails with the Department of Defense, youth sports, what our committees are doing, and some of the real challenges. And I'll tell you, the day I look forward to the least is Mondays. I have a packed clinic. At the end of the day, I got to go make rounds and do the pre-ops for the next day. And always my secretary is paging me, Dr. Pellman's on the phone from the NFL. And it's always some new disaster that, you know, and I'll go through some of that with you. Well, I think if Kevin wants me to shorten this to one slide, this is it. The culture change that I think we have to enact in our young athletes, our adult athletes, is it's great to play through pain. That's a wonderful life lesson. It's why a lot of us are here, why we succeed in life, and perhaps wouldn't have if it weren't for sport. But you don't play through brain or spine injury. That can jeopardize everything, and that's the Zach Lystedt story. Well, I won't dwell on this, but the velocity, the strength, the power, conditioning of our athletes now at the professional level is different than it was a number of years ago. They are in harm's way, and it's simply like we are when we drive on a freeway. There are cars coming in opposite directions, weighing tons, and you are in harm's way. There's a white stripe between you and misery. You know, the people that have joined us in this effort with the National Football League are very sensitive to one thing. You know, we're responsible for 2,000 professional athletes, but it's all about the student athletes, all levels and both genders. And I thought Margot might touch on this, but it is likely that girls and women athletes may actually be at higher risk than their male counterparts. And it's about our armed forces serving globally. We're going to work very closely with them. We sort of walked into a perfect storm, and I'll show you a little bit of the background of that. But whenever you have a perfect storm and a confluence of unhappiness, it's also an opportunity for change. And I hope that we're successful in doing that. Well, what's the problem? Evidence of long-term damage, a very sobering event yesterday that may or may not be related. Increasing reports of concussions in our youth athletes and our soldiers coming back. General Chiarelli has made it clear that up to 60% of returning veterans have some sort of post-traumatic disorder. The New York Times got involved in 2007. Alan Schwartz driving the effort, congressional hearings that followed, and that really set the stage. Now, what about youth athletes? I was showing one slide, one comment. The brain matures slowly. As you can see in Dr. Guskowitz, it can take decades for a brain. But myelination is a process whereby our nerves, you know, our nerve cells, which are connected to fibers that go out to there, that connection becomes myelinated or sheathed. It's just like an electrical cable with a what do you call it? Insulation. Thank you. Insulation around it that improves the conduction, and it makes that cable safer in its environment. Myelin does that for our brains. And if you think about when people tend to acquire executive functions, that tends to be in your age group at the NCAA. In the early to mid-20s is when those processes develop, and it's likely that that is a myelin-dependent issue. And before the brain is fully myelinated, it is more susceptible to injuries that you've been hearing about. And I'll mention second impact. As a neurosurgeon, I see brains of traumatized children all the time, and what you see when you look at it is different than an adult. These brains are very hyperdynamic. Once you get the dura opened, they're bang, bang with every heartbeat. You can just imagine what a second injury before recovery does, and that is the Zach Lystedt story, and he's just one. The long-term effects, this is nothing new. This was first reported in 1928, dementia pugilistica from boxing, and it's now been documented in many individuals, and it is, I believe, going to be related to several things, one of which is genetic susceptibility. We have the capability of measuring this. The ApoE alleles, E4 in particular, prevents good repair of damaged neurons, where the E2s do much better, and I think that's going to be important. And we see the brains of autopsy specimens from people that have been afflicted with what we call chronic traumatic encephalopathy. The staining that you see here is not where you see staining in Alzheimer's disease, which is deep in the brain. This is very superficial in an area where it's certainly consistent with an athletic injury. Well, this is a statement by one president of the United States. Do not report back to me, do you have a game that is acceptable to the entire nation, and so on. Brutality and foul play. This is an old statement from 2005, and you've heard allusions to the genesis of the NCAA related to that challenge. But what happened in the NFL? Congress got interested because they thought that the NFL, they treated it as a monopoly and therefore legislatively sanctioned. They recognized the trickle-down, rapid trickle-down to youth sports. Alan Schwartz took it as his charge, I think, with targeting a Pulitzer Prize. And the former committee members were roasted in congressional hearings, and at the same time, the Boston University and others were putting out reports. And that really put Roger in a bind. And I think I won't go into the grim details of it, but there were several proceedings with this, with a judiciary subcommittee in which unfortunate testimony was used. And just the one quick one, the chairwoman is named Chairwoman Sanchez from California. And it says that on her name tag, so it's helpful so you know what to call her. And a response at some point was to a question, do you think that repetitive head trauma can cause permanent damage? The answer was, lady, lady, there are a lot of dumb Americans out there, and some of them played football. That is not the best response that you could use. So the commissioner fired the co-chairs in October. This was widely reported. In December, he issued the rules that Margot alluded to. Any signs of or symptoms of concussion, you're out of practice or play, can't return. That requires an independent physician to clear you back to play. In April, he appointed Rich Ellenbogen, myself, and Mitch Berger to our new committee. And within 3 weeks, we got a call, boys, can you meet us in New York for a hearing for the subcommittee tomorrow, which is nice. So the charge from the commissioner was very simple: make the game safer for our players, make decisions based on the best science, which you've heard. Medical decisions trump